Hello, YouTube. Sidekick here with another installment of It's Not You, It's ME, my occasional series on using the mission editor, DCS. If you haven't checked out the previous videos in this series, I'd kind of encourage you to do that before you get into this topic, because before you can really appreciate what we're going to talk about today, you're going to want to know a little bit about how to use the mission editor. Because today, my friends, we are going to open the door on the dark secrets of the world of scripting for DCS. I'll let that sink in for a minute in case you want to make whatever preparation you normally make in preparation for defense against the dark arts. Now, don't get too worried. We're not going to open the door very far, at least not for today. Actually, in all seriousness, learning about how scripting works in the DCS Mission Editor is very useful. And to some extent, my reason for making this video is to prove that it does not have to be a full immersion experience through which you need to be born again into the world of the code nerd. Although, in all honesty, you might find that hard to believe if you look at some other introductions to coding for DCS. And don't get me wrong, I'm not knocking the work that others have done to try and demystify the topic. It's just that, most of the time the people who try to introduce this topic are already experts with a background in writing computer code. And B, this is a pool that gets pretty deep pretty quickly. And if you follow an expert swimmer, it's easy to find yourself in over your head before you've learned how to tread water. So, to be clear, I'm not going to try to do anything that really explains how scripting works, much less all of the things that you can accomplish using scripts in DCS. Others have done a much better job of that than I ever could. But I am going to try and provide a non-code warrior introduction to using scripts. This is definitely going to be a dummy's guide to Lua scripting, not because I think you guys might be dummies, but because I know that I am on this topic. So to be absolutely clear on my background and my reviewer's tilt going into this topic, I have never written finished computer code professionally. I have written some for my own use, and in a previous lifetime, I did design algorithms for others to code. To give some perspective on that, though, I should note that I was writing that code in Fortran and Pascal. For those of you under the age of 50, look it up in the Ancient History of Computing section on Wikipedia. So I know enough about how computer code works to be dangerous, and I understand about variables and functions and if-then-else statements and do loops, but my experience very much predates even the concept of object-oriented programming, so words like class, method, and object have meanings to me that they don't to anyone familiar with the modern software development. The best that I can say is that the way I'm going to approach the topic of scripting in DCS is that I'm mostly going to be aiming it at folks like me. People who know a little bit about writing their own computer code, but for whom modern code speak really is a species of foreign language. If that's you, watch on. Hopefully you'll learn something. If you are already a modern-day code warrior, watch and be entertained as we dinosaurs from a bygone age wallow into the tar pits of Lua. Anyways, let's start with the basics. What's a script in DCS, and what is this Lua of which you speak? A script is basically computer code written in a language called Lua that runs while DCS is running. Though through Lua code, you can access information about what's going on in DCS, and you can issue commands to do just about anything you could accomplish with the mission editor, and actually probably a whole lot more. But you can do it in real time while the game is being played. DCS scripts can range anywhere from a single script command line that you call directly in response to a certain event to literally thousands of lines of code that are loaded when the mission starts and which basically define the whole mission, including how the game will react to real-time events. As such, scripts really are a very powerful tool, and in truth, most really complex missions are probably controlled by scripts rather than by the trigger system, which is why scripting is viewed by many as a bit of a dark art. When you're used to controlling your missions via the trigger system, and then you open somebody else's complex mission to find that pretty much the only trigger is one that calls a mission script file, and then if you know enough to find that script file, You'll take a look at it and note that it runs to a couple thousand lines. You should not be faulted at that point for wondering what deal the mission developer made with what dark power in order to be able to produce something of such dark and terrible convoluted beauty, especially if the guy's username invokes images of mythical and powerful beasts of death and destruction. You know who you are. But wait, there is hope for mere mortals in this realm. As I said, we do not have to wade all the way out into those deep waters. We can stand here in the shallows and just get our feet wet. So let's do that, shall we? First of all, let's start by looking at what scripting is good for and why you might want to use it. As I noted, you can control whole missions using script, pretty much instead of using the triggers, but you don't have to go that far to get some experience with using and writing scripts. The way I see it, there are really two basic things you can do with scripts. Firstly, and most simply, you can issue commands directly to DCS using a script. In many cases, these commands pretty much duplicate the sorts of things you can accomplish with triggers, but with some advantages that we'll discuss in a minute. The second thing you can do is to write scripts which execute and then stay active while DCS runs. Typically, this code is used to trap specific events as they happen and then respond or schedule certain events to happen at certain times. Now, as you can imagine, both of those capabilities are very flexible and very powerful, and they are the basis for most of the mission scripts that you'll find. But still, it is not necessary to use these capabilities to script entire missions, as I hope I'll get a chance to show you. But first, though, let's go back and just take a look at using Lua scripts in their simplest form to very directly issue one-time commands to DCS. So why would you want to replicate a command that you can issue through the trigger system with a Lua script? I mean, what's the point? Well, there are actually a few reasons. First of all, there are some commands available through the script engine that aren't available through the trigger system. Second of all, using a scripting language gives you some flow control, so you can ensure that things happen in the right sequence, which you can do with triggers, but is kind of convoluted. Using a script can also be easier because you can use variable names instead of numbered flags. And crucially, you can interact with those variables and modify them in ways that the trigger system won't allow you to. Lua commands will also allow you to query the game engine for certain kinds of information, like, for instance, the actual locations of units and objects in the game world. This information is not available through the trigger system. Finally, if you have a series of actions that you would like to execute in response to a variety of situations, with some slight variation depending on the situation, it might actually be easier to write some code with a couple of if-then-else statements and then call that same code many times, rather than having to clone a particular trigger over and over and over again. And this will especially be true if debugging is required, because I'm sure anybody who's done that has been faced with a situation where they hit the trigger, clone it 5 or 6 times, and then find out that they wanted to add something to the trigger, and then you have to modify 5 or 6 triggers, which can become a pain. So let's take a quick look at an example of a simple piece of code that you might want to write to make your missions more interesting. Now, a quick admin note. When writing Lua code, you're going to need a few things beyond DCS. The first of these is an application in which to write the code. Now, you can write Lua code in any text editor, but I am going to suggest that you take a quick look for a dedicated Lua editor. There are a number available for free download. I use one called Zero Brain, and I really like it. There's some other tools you're probably going to want eventually if you start doing anything that requires more than very simple debugging. Chief amongst these will be a log file display tool. Again, there are several available, and I use glog, which is spelled Glogg. Okay, so let's set the stage for what we want to do in the mission editor. Let's take the basic outline of the whack-a-mole mission I released a while back as kind of the template. The idea of that mission was that the player would be flying an OV-10 Bronco as an airborne FAC. I'm looking for enemy bunker complexes in the jungle. To make it interesting and replayable, I wanted the enemy locations to be random. Now, we looked at how to do some limited randomization in an earlier video, but that technique involves setting up multiple enemy groups at fixed locations and then choosing randomly between them. That does work, but it's actually a lot of work to set up, and it only provides pretty limited replayability because eventually players are going to get to know all of the available spawn locations. Better technique would be to have only one enemy group, but to spawn and respawn it at random during the mission. And thankfully there's a way of doing that using Lua. The command that you need for that is actually not natively part of DCS. It is provided by a larger code library called MIST, M-I-S-T. MIST is one of the two kind of primary DCS code libraries provided by third parties for mission scripting. Sometimes they're also called mission scripting frameworks. The other one besides MIST is one called Moose, M-O-O-S-E, and you might have heard of it. Again, I'm not intending in this series to go into any detail about all of the extra functionality offered by MIST and by Moose, but I do need to mention them because we will be using a MIST function, and since we are, we'll need to ensure that we load the MIST code library when we load the mission, and I'll show you how to do that in a sec. Now, the MIST function that we're looking for is called mist.respawninZone. The best place to find out about it is in the Hoggit wiki, which is pretty much my first go-to stop for anything to do with scripting in DCS, frankly. On the Hoggit wiki, we find the following entry. So this basically says that using this function, all we need to do is give it a group name, and then we have to give it at least one zone name, but we can actually give it a list of zone names. And it will basically, when this function is called, it will spawn that group randomly somewhere inside that list of zones. Now, there's some other things that we could do with it. You can see the options in green are variable options. I'm not going to worry about them right now because all I really want to do is access this functionality that lets us put the group somewhere randomly on the map. So what we're going to have to do in the mission editor is set up the group that we want, and we're going to set it to late activation so that it won't show up on the map immediately. It'll only show up once we call this function, and when we call this function, it will put it somewhere randomly in some trigger zone. So let's go to DCS and take a look at that. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to do here in DCS is open the mission editor, and we're going to go look up the file we want, which I'm going to call spawn testing. So in spawn testing, I've already got this set up. We basically have two things. We have a group. It's a bunker that is surrounded by 4 watchtowers. It is set to late activation, and it is called ground-1 with a capital G because case sensitivity is important. The other thing we have is just a 1 kilometer zone called spawn-1, and that's with a capital S. So those are the two things, the two elements of the mission. So if we pop out of DCS and go take a look at the Hoggit reference again, it says that we need a string name, and we need a group name, and we need a zone name. So if we hop over here into ZeroBrain, we can write that command, and it will look like this, and I've already done that, just because I don't think you need to watch me typing. So mist.respawninZone, case sensitive. Very important to remember that Lua is always case sensitive. And then we put in quotes ground-1, which was the name of the group, and spawn-1, which was the name of the zone. So all good. We save this as respawn-test.lua. We need to remember the name of the file. Okay, so technically this is a pretty simple file because it's just one command, but we're going to make it a little bit more complicated as we go along. But so what would we do in DCS if we want to execute that command? Well, we go to the trigger system, and as you can see, we need 2 triggers. The first of these is to do a script file called mist-4-5-107, and that is just the latest version of MIST. When you go to do this, you may find that there's a later release of Mist, and so you may want to load that. I've just put a flag on equals 1 there, just, normal mission editor procedures. Good to have a flag there maybe later, but we're not going to use it right now. Second trigger that we want is one to load our new random spawn command. I'm going to put a time as more than 3 in here just to give us a minute to get the mission loaded up. And go to the F10 map so we can see the group appear. And then we're going to load the script file. So again, we remember the name of our script file. If we like, we can actually, if I go to date modified, it'll be the last one I modified. Respawn test.lua, load that. It's really important every time you make a change to a Lua file that you actually go into the trigger that loads it and reload it, and then hit the save button. What this does is it means that the mission will actually read the Lua file in and will save it as part of the mission. Occasionally it will happen if you do not reload the file, the mission will run with the old version of it. So every time you save a Lua file, you need to reload it in the mission editor. I'm going to say that again. Every time you save a new version of your Lua file, you need to reload it in the mission editor. And it seems to be sort of best practice to save the mission after you do that to make sure that the file comes along with the mission. Occasionally, it's just a DCS mission editor funny. That can go badly if you don't do that. Okay, so I think we're all ready to run the mission, so let's run the mission. And it loads, and we pop in. I'm going to press the F10 key and watch. And hey presto, the enemy appears. So take a note of where they appeared. We'll run it again just to prove that we are actually getting a random location. F10 again. And there you see we got the group in a different location, and we can do it even one more time. And there you go. So let's go back to the mission editor. Okay, so let's say we want to get just a little fancier here and set up the file so that it just randomly respawns that group at an interval, just so we can see it respawn. We can do that with the trigger system. It's pretty simple. I've got it set up here. So same first trigger where we turn flag 1 on. Then when I'm done with the second trigger, set it to a repetitive action. Now instead of time is more, I'm using the time since the flag, setting it to 3 seconds. This time again, we just load our script file, and we turn the flag off, then we turn it back on, and that means that the timer resets, and then 3 seconds later, because it's a repetitive action, it'll do it again. So let's test that. Once again, we start the mission, go to F10 and just watch. Here's the first time, by the shores of the lake. And there it is the second time. And the third time, that wasn't much of a change, but it was a new location. So you can see that our script is running. Oh, there's good different location. And it's actually putting our enemy group in a random location every time that it spawns. Okay, so back in the mission editor, I've made some changes here to the file. Maybe we decided that we don't just want to spawn the group in the one zone, we want to spawn it around the island, but we don't want to spawn it here in the middle, so we're going to use multiple zones spread around the jungle areas of the island that we're going to spawn the group into. So, of course, if we come out to our Lua code, it's possible to do that. You remember that the mist.spawn in respawn in zone function allows us to put in a table of zone names instead of a single string. So I've set it up this way where I've actually defined the table explicitly as a local variable, which you want to do to avoid potentially contaminating. If you have a larger script framework like Mist, it may have a variable, or it might have a global variable named Zen. You want to avoid that. So you use the local statement to define Z as a local table, or Z for my American friends. And then to denote it as a table, I use a curly bracket at either end, and then it's just a list of values in quotes separated by commas. So the table is denoted by the curly brackets at the end, and the elements of this table happen to be a bunch of strings separated by commas. And then I issue the mis.respawn in zone command, ground 1 as it used to be, and I have replaced the string that we used to have there with the variable z, which represents this table. So by doing this, Lua is going to take all of these and it's going to put them in here, and it's going to mean that we can spawn ground 1 in any one of those 5 zones. I've renamed the table respawn test A.Lua, and I have already saved it. So now we need to go back to DCS. We need to go into the trigger system, and we need to make sure that we are loading the right file. And after we load it, we're going to hit the save button, and then we're going to run. Once again, we load the file, hit the F10 key, pull back a little bit here, and there we see spawning. That was probably zone 2. That was zone 5. That's probably zone 5 again. And you can see that now we are actually spawning the group around the periphery of the island inside the zones that we had defined. So that seems to be working. Okay, so I think that's going to do it for today. The video is already over 20 minutes long. I don't really want to get into anything new at this point in the video, but there still is a lot more that we can do just even with this very simple test file. For instance, I think one of the things that we'll want to do is take a look at ways of extracting some information from DCS using scripts. So in the next installment of this, we'll take a look at getting the group that when it spawns to report its location and maybe use its location to measure its distance from either a known point or from a friendly unit or something like that, just to demonstrate the kinds of things that you can do with a Lua script. And again, this is all just a very simple Lua file. Right now, it only contains 2 lines, literally. We call it whenever we need it. It doesn't need to be a long script file that runs at the beginning and stays running. This is really just a series of commands that we're calling when we need them, and we're using the trigger system to decide when we call them. So we are doing scripting, and we are doing things that we quite literally could not do without the script, but it doesn't have to be an extremely complicated situation, and it doesn't have to be a situation where you really understand that much about writing computer code in order to be able to make use of it. In the next installment, we'll probably get into a little bit more coding so that we can do things like write a function that measures distance between 2 points and that sort of thing, but it still won't be very complicated. So I hope you stay tuned for the next installment. If you did like this one, please do subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, like the video, and also recommend it to your friends. For now, this is going to be Sidekick, signing off.